Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we've got another unscripted movie review, this time of one you've all been waiting for, of the newest Marvel film, Avengers Endgame. So, okay, this video was supposed to have been put together last night. I saw the movie, I sat down, I really enjoyed it. Spoiler alert, I did really enjoy the movie. It's worth seeing. If you haven't seen it already, you probably should. And I'm going to try to avoid spoiling the movie as much as I possibly can. And going from there, obviously, if you've seen the end of Infinity War, yeah, that happened. That's kind of important to talk about whatever happens going forward. But I say all that because I sat down and I did a mostly glowing review of the project. I had my quibbles, I had my nitpicks. Having slept on them, I stand by those, and we will get back to said nitpicks. But then I made the mistake of watching a lot of other reviews of Endgame that have been posted thus far online. Specifically, Dan Olsen put out a video called Let's Spoil the Endgame. And then I sort of realized that he was going block by block through certain points that I had said in my review. And I'm sitting back here with, well, what even are you supposed to say about a movie that is a culmination of a decade's worth of storytelling that you can't really talk about at length when it comes to thematic deconstruction without massive amounts of spoilers? Now, granted, I would consistently make the argument that the spoilers aren't really the point, and indeed the entire focus of this particular Marvel movie has been the journey in order to get to certain points, because if you understand certain tension-destroying elements that I pointed out when I talked about Infinity War and are to some extent just as applicable here, then the whole arc of spoilers shouldn't really be the conversation. Certain twists and surprises and characters living or dying shouldn't matter, because ultimately we're talking about a serialized narrative in the sort of the way that we used to get in comic books, and we know things are going to go back to the way they were in some form. Status quo will be changed and then maybe likely often reestablished. So spoilers shouldn't be an issue, but since we're dealing with a different medium that isn't as accustomed to this sort of reset, difference between film and comics, then we're stuck with a situation where I have to come in here and talk at length about a thematic arc in terms of an overall review of a film to which so much of its structure is effectively walled off behind spoilers. And that's kind of infuriating. I'll say that right now. I'd say that, does it make sense for this review to have a certain grace and say, you know what, screw spoilers, these are the people that died, this pays off specific arcs? Well, yeah, sure, that would be the obvious way to do it. I'd piss off a lot of you, and then I'd just basically put spoilers in the title, and then that would probably get around it in order to facilitate the conversation. But really, we can't do that, because ultimately, we're in the content producing mill, and everything that I say, likely positive or negative, surrounding spoilers or lack thereof, facilitates how Marvel's still gonna get $1 billion off this movie. If I sound exasperating, I very much am, because I had an idea of where I wanted to take this conversation. And there are thematic elements that I appreciate that start off in the very beginning of the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe that land here, and I respect how well they were able to stick the landing for a couple of characters that really did feel resonant. I like how they drew an ultimate closure that surrounded a lot of Iron Man's arc. I liked it with Captain America as well. In a peculiar way, given the changes that have surrounded Thor, I appreciate that too. The whole core team of Avengers, with maybe the exception of the Hulk, I think they ultimately stuck the landing in terms of a larger overarching cinematic universe arc. Whether they will stay around or they'll go off into yonder, wherever things might happen. Inevitably, a film like this, even by calling it Endgame and signaling the end of this particular subset of Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, it does have to continue on. There's more projects that are coming, and yes, again, certain tension-destroying element, like I have to say that, and that's not a spoiler because it's publicly available. There are certain arcs that were established in Phase 1 that going into more recent movies haven't been as clearly delineated, and yet you know for a fact that Marvel's going to try to build similar long-standing arcs to those characters in future Marvel films. A lot of people bring up Doctor Strange, they'll bring up Spider-Man, they'll bring up Black Panther, even though I think to some extent their solo movies have done a fairly okay job building a certain amount of core narrative, even if I ultimately do think that it's a lot stronger for the original Phase 1 cast. Well, even then I wouldn't say it's that much stronger for Thor, but that's a different conversation again. But it ultimately comes back to the fact that I do respect the Russo brothers for ending the arcs the way they did, and drawing such a firm line in the sand, to the point where fellow music critics and fellow film critics have said this should be the end of superhero movies at that scale, because how in the nine hells are you going to top this? Because if there is one thing about this film, the amount of wide shots that are pure, blatant fan service, I gotta give Marvel a lot of credit for actually indulging that much. It's to the point where non-Marvel obsessed critics have really come down on this movie, saying, yeah, it's draggy, it's full of a bunch of inside jokes. The action beats do not hit the same way as they were in arguably better paced Marvel movies. That's true, for the record. But at some level, if you're invested in this long-standing cinematic experience, you won't care. And I think the big con that the Marvel Cinematic Universe managed to pull was actually making it feel like it was worthwhile and paid off such an ending like this. Now, what this means for the rest of the company going forward, because again, I don't think there's a feasible way they can top this in the near future without rebuilding some significant character directions, especially with all the properties that are still in flux. Hell, I'd even say that with some of the properties they introduced right before this movie and going forward, because again, for as much as a lot of people were worried that Captain Marvel would be a Deus Ex Machina, doesn't really happen, except that her position in the plot still feels very much like one, if that makes any sense. But at the same time, I struggle more with this movie as an entity within the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe archetype, especially going forward. As a straightforward film on its own, yeah, I've got my quibbles. I think that there's an element of darkness that I really wish they had indulged in a little bit more, especially if you're going to make the time to do so throughout the first act of the film. I think that, again, the second act is a little self-indulgent, not to the point where it actively got grating, because the humor was still there, and there was enough cinematic flair and moments that bounced off each other that I think managed to stick the landing, even if I do think some of the reframing of certain things that we have expected to feel a little, I think they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, for lack of better words. And Marvel's always had a certain amount of self-awareness about that, but there are points that got a little bit too cute. And again, when you're dealing with a time travel narrative, while I can appreciate some elements of streamlining, I do think that there were other elements that they feel preemptively correcting of things that, well, we didn't really care to know. And I think you probably could have streamlined the narratives and the larger emotional arcs beyond a few of the main significant ones. Now, granted, when you're looking at the main significant ones, they hit like gangbusters, and I can really appreciate that. Even if certain other elements they feel more subtextual and landing where they should. There's a couple ones that where we've known the characters for as long as they have, and there is an emotional core that it remains consistent, that I question what they'll do in the future, but it does land here. That's ultimately why I do think this is a great movie. It's great in terms of where it draws the line. It's great as an event comic in that specific scene. It has the highest stakes possible in order to drive that point home. I gotta respect how well it structures that final closing climax, even if getting to that point it can be a little sluggish and misshapen getting there. You know, like all the Avengers movies are, because they're all kind of sluggish and misshapen around the edges. Overall, there's a limit to how angry or exasperated or annoyed as I can be, because at the end of the day, it's a family-friendly popcorn filler that's beautifully photographed, has plenty of quippable lines. If you're talking about the elements that will pay off certain comic book fanboy arcs, you will get the applause lines, and this movie certainly did. And there is an emotional core to, I want to say, about a third of the characters I think have really, really strong emotional arcs. And again, when you're balancing emotional arcs with so many characters, that really has to be what you have. And I'm amazed they got that many in ways that I think the tension-destroying elements of Infinity War prevented them from fully realizing here. So I'll give the Russo brothers a lot of props for that. I will say that there's certain elements that you can very clearly tell were put in by Marvel, specifically as maybe not teasers, but test runs of certain dynamics that they want to try pushing going forward, because, again, they need some ideas to fill in whatever's been building up for the past decade. I can respect the mechanism. I wish I didn't clearly see the mechanism as much as I do, but that's the sort of thing that happens when you have this conversation. And if I managed to get through all this without spoiling a couple major plot points, I applaud myself. I can't say I entirely did. But again, you're all going to see the movie anyway. I understand how a lot of this movie's criticism and conversation might fall very much in line with somebody who's going to make a video talking about how this movie gets reviewed. And then I'm kind of getting meta by mentioning that. At the same time, at the end of the day, I think we're overthinking the whole spoiler dichotomy when it is the journey that gets us there. And I think textually, it lands enough the beats. I think emotionally, I think it sticks the landing better than I think Infinity War did. And I ultimately think this movie is a little bit better than Infinity War long term. I think the two of them, when viewed together, will hold up reasonably well. I think there's a lot of credit that deserves to be given to both Karen Gillan and Paul Rudd for really stepping up how their roles have evolved within the current Avengers paradigm. It was better than I expected. Even if I do think that the criticism that tonally this can feel a little bit more cartoonish is absolutely true. And probably my biggest nitpick within the first 2 acts of the movie is I wish they had imbued this film with a little bit more of some of the darker gravitas that came through in Infinity War. But really, if all my issues come down to tonal questions, especially when tonal questions that were always going to be so difficult to jive and bring together, given the number of characters and the emotional arcs that have been carried forward for, again, decades, I gotta get props for what we have. So I'm thinking a light 8 out of 10, absolutely worth your time. You've all seen this, and while I'm not going to spoil anything, again, this is a comic book movie. So even if I said that certain characters died or certain characters were sent away or certain things happened, when time travel's in the mix, you always know how things can get wound back. And while there has been some fundamental changes to the current status quo that I have no idea how they're going to handle properly, I do respect how far they've gone in order to lay enough of the pieces in place that they can bring everything back to where they want it to be. Even with certain characters, if you look at their contracts, it's not going to go anywhere. But yeah, go check out the film. I hope you all enjoy it. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And, I didn't make things go away properly last time. So, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.